Thanks, Karen. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Nicole Bramhall. I'm a palliative care registrar working in Leicestershire. I've been asked to talk to you today about my experience of doing the Associate PI scheme for the Chelsea 2 study at Loros. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about what the Associate PI scheme is for those of you that haven't heard of it, that might be interested in finding out a bit more. I'll do a quick update on how the Chelsea 2 study is going at Loros and just draw it all together with my overall experience and how positive it's been. Next slide, please. So the API scheme is run by the National Institute for Health and Care Research. It's the Associate Principal Investigator scheme. So it's a 6-month in-work training programme that you take alongside your current clinical role. So you work closely with the local principal investigator for a specific study who acts as your mentor throughout the whole scheme. It's ideal for people who haven't had the opportunity to be involved in clinical research or portfolio studies during their day-to-day role. So if you're completely research naive like I was, it's a really good starting point. There's no funding requirements. You don't have to pay to do the scheme. You don't get paid to do it either. And there's not really much in terms of entry requirements onto the scheme. You just have to be interested and willing to devote your time to it. There's some recent surveying of API alumni that's been really positive in showing that lots of people that have gone through the scheme have stayed engaged in research, which is fantastic. Next slide, please. So who can join the Associate PI scheme? So it's open to any health and care professional, as long as you don't have research as part of your core clinical role. So it's not just doctors, nurses, it can be physiotherapists, occupational therapists. They're really keen to get a diverse range of the MDT involved in this scheme. Like I said, you really have to be willing to make a significant contribution to the conduct and delivery of a study at a local level for at least 6 months. And really, I had no research experience going into this scheme. It's the reason when I heard about it at last year's Research and Audit Day, that's what inspired me to get involved, to develop skills and to learn more about what the world of clinical research is like. So don't be put off if you've got an empty research CV like I did. It's really aimed at people predominantly who haven't got any experience. Next slide, please. So what's involved in the scheme? So the only kind of requirement pre-course is that you complete your good clinical practice training, which is easily accessible on the NIHR website. You have to have a study at a single site that's going to be running for at least the next 6 months. You can join the study at any part of the study, so it could be in the setup phase or further along, but it must include recruitment of participants. That's one of your key competencies that needs to be signed off. So as long as you have the opportunity to recruit patients, you can join studies on the API scheme that have already commenced. They recommend being able to devote about 2 to 3 hours per week to the API scheme and delivery of the study, which feels like a reasonable amount, especially if you're working full time in the clinical setting. But this is flexible. It's mostly self-directed learning. So if you're willing to be flexible, then it's going to work best that way. There's a learning pathway on the NIHR website, which I've taken an example of to the side here, and it just gives you an idea of how the online website supports your learning. You work through these monthly kind of objectives that aren't hugely rigid. They recommend that by month 1 and 2 you meet a certain number of competencies, but it's not the end of the world if you don't get it achieved in that specific month. You can carry it through, and I think they're very realistic that research doesn't always follow a linear path, and it's flexible. So it's a very easy website and interface to use and to evidence your learning on. There's no sort of essay or big piece of work that you have to hand in at the end of the scheme. What you do have to hand in is your associate PI checklist, which is signed off by the principal investigator that's supervising you and the national study coordinator at the end of the scheme. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the API checklist. It's a few pages long. It looks quite daunting to begin with, but it just breaks down each of your core activities that you should be getting involved in the study. There's also some additional activities that aren't mandatory, but that you may get involved in. But to kind of pick out a few, you can see that being involved in disseminating study in your local environment, giving presentations to members of staff and key stakeholders, regular checks and screening for participants on the inclusion log. And what you really do is just from day one keep a log of everything that you're doing, small activities to big activities, just so you can evidence that you're engaging in the scheme. And probably the biggest one is the patient-related activities, so consenting patients into the study, so taking informed consents from participants is probably the biggest one that requires lots of work, but it's very achievable if you're working at the site where the study is being delivered. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in getting involved in the API scheme, there's a QR code there that links you to the website, or you can just Google it. It's very easy to find. I'd speak to your local research department about any opportunities that are currently available. In order to do the scheme, the study that you're interested in has to be registered to the API scheme. So there's a part on their website where you can search locally to see what studies are being delivered and whether that's linked to the API scheme. If there's a study you're interested in and it's not linked to the scheme, you can speak to the PI or the CI about that. And I think it's relatively straightforward to contact the API scheme to get it registered if you're really interested in one specific area. You just have to ask permission from the PI that you want to supervise you, and as long as they approve, you can complete the application form, which is very straightforward. Next slide, please. And this is just an example of the Where Can I Take Part tool on the website. So you can see I just searched for Leicestershire and Rutland Hospice, and it shows our one study that's linked to the API scheme on the left, which is the Chelsea 2 study. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Chelsea 2 study, which is the study that I did my associate PI scheme for. I'm not going to go into loads and loads of detail because that's a whole talk in itself. And I'm sure lots of you are familiar with the study, having worked locally. There's 4 centres in the East Midlands that are actively recruiting participants at the moment. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a study that's being run by the University of Surrey. It's a cluster randomised trial of clinically assisted hydration at the end of life. The reason they're doing it is because there's currently insufficient good quality studies to inform practice of whether giving hydration at the end of life is a good thing, if it's a bad thing, if it makes no difference. It's led by the University of Surrey, but it's disseminated across 80 sites in the UK, which are predominantly hospice sites, but there are a few hospital sites, I believe. Each site is aiming to recruit 20 participants, so there should be about 1,600 patients in total once the study is completed. And we started recruiting as a whole nationally last October, and it's due to finish recruitment next September. And their hypothesis that they're testing is whether clinically assisted hydration last days of life reduces the frequency of delirium as a result of preserving renal function and preventing the buildup of drugs and toxins. So that's what they're ultimately looking to either prove or disprove. Next slide, please. This is a map of all the sites that are currently involved in the study. It's colour-coded by how many participants they've recruited. So see the vast majority of places are between 0 and 10 participants, and there are some sites further south and in the West Midlands that look like they're almost finishing recruitment. Locally, we've got sites at Loros, Nottingham, Derby, and up in Mansfield also. Next slide, please. The primary objective of the study is to look at the proportion of patients who develop delirium at any point during the trial, but given the nature of the trial, there are lots of secondary objectives that they can pull from this study as well, including levels of sedation, upper airway secretions, impact of clinically assisted hydration on overall survival, adverse effects, etc. So hopefully once the final results are published in a few years, there'll be lots of helpful data either way to guide our practice. And the inclusion criteria is patients that are felt to be actively dying in the final days of life. So at Loris, we've been using the kind of final week of life as our measure of that. They're not maintaining their fluid intake orally themselves. And of note, they shouldn't have an indication for or against clinically assisted hydration in order to be included. There's lots of exclusion criteria as well, which I won't go into today, but that's important to consider as well because there's been worries about the potential harmful impact of fluids on patients that are dying. So there's, like I said, quite a long list of exclusions that need to be considered for each individual. Next slide, please. So where are we up to at Loris at the moment with the Chelsea 2 study? So we were randomised to intervention B, which is we carry on everything as normal and continuing what oral intake patients can have if able, regular mouth care and managing symptoms in the usual way. But the difference is that we give clinically assisted hydration parenterally, so either intravenously, more commonly we've noticed would be subcutaneously at the hospice. We started recruitment in January 2023. We've currently recruited 8 patients into the study. We had to temporarily pause recruitment in February just to iron out a few teething issues and have some feedback from the wider clinical teams. There were some concerns, despite lots of pre-work going into kind of the education of staff before the study was commenced. There were things that we couldn't anticipate, and there was lots of opportunity to listen to clinical team members about concerns and feeding that back. So we paused for a few weeks and we continued, and things have been running much smoother since then. One thing we've noticed is that most of our consent is from patients next of kin. So we're trying to have earlier discussions now with patients that we're recognising will likely be at the hospice for end-of-life care. So having those chats earlier with them to get their thoughts on whether this is something they would or would not be interested in. And then it's less of the onus and responsibility is on their next of kin. Next slide, please. And we recently had a site monitoring visit. The feedback was really positive, no areas of concern. Of note, they said the data collection and source data was really good. And it was completed and documented really clearly and accurately. So that's really helpful to hear. And thank you to all the clinical staff members that have been facilitating that, because ultimately we wouldn't have any data if it wasn't for the people on the shop floor doing all the checks and regular observations. Next slide, please. So just to finish, my overall experience of the API scheme for Chelsea 2 has been really positive. I was a bit apprehensive going into it. I'd never really been involved in clinical research before, so I wasn't sure how much was expected of me or how much work this was going to be, but it really has helped me develop my knowledge and skills in research. It's a really supportive process. The API team are very accessible via email, and also the local research team at Loris have been a fantastic source of support. It felt manageable a long time, a full-time clinical role. I think the key is just to be flexible. I did undertake the scheme during 2 different clinical rotations. So if there are any doctors in training that are thinking of doing the API scheme, it's just to bear in mind what placements you might be on whilst undertaking this. So it's definitely easier if you're working primarily at the site where the study's being delivered. Like I said, there were some challenges with recruitment. I think we thought we'd be potentially much further along than we are by now, but that's, I think, the reality of clinical research. It has been a change in our usual practice, and I know lots of team members have struggled with that. It's quite a contentious and thought-provoking study, fluids at the end of life. It's not something that lots of us have had as our usual standard of practice throughout our careers. So it's it's definitely making people think about things and think about their practice differently. Finally, I did have to ask for an extension to my API scheme. So I said earlier that it's 6 months minimum. By about 4.5 months in, we'd only recruited 2 or 3 patients. So I hadn't really had enough time to evidence that I could competently consent patients independently into the study. So it was very simple to just email them and say, please, can I have a bit more time to complete the scheme? They gave me a 3-month extension, which was more than enough time to get everything signed off. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for listening, and especially thanks to Christina Fall and Sue Ashton and the rest of the research team for their support and guidance through my time on the scheme, and to all the clinical team at Lauros for helping to facilitate and continuing to facilitate the Chelsea 2 study on site. I put my email address down at the bottom if anyone would like to talk more about my experience of the scheme. And it'd be great to hear from anyone else that's interested or is doing the scheme, or how Chelsea 2 is going at the other sites in the East Midlands. Thank you very much.